Okay, so I'm not really excited to watch this debate. I'm really not. And there's a few reasons. Number one, I'm not a fan of Breaking Point. I think their reporting on the war has been reckless. I think that it's been inaccurate. I think in some instances they just have like published straight up lies without evidence. Sometimes even publishing the evidence about why they're lying as they lie on TV about the war. I think I'll just cite the most recent example, which we've already done something on the show about. It was when they were talking about the bombings of Crimea, and when one of the missiles en route got intercepted above the beach, above a local beach, and then some of the shrapnel hit the beach. It ended up killing 3 people. The way that they reported it was that the Ukrainians purposefully targeted the beach, killing Russian civilians because they don't really think that they're civilians actually. Instead of like a follow-up strike on top of the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 strikes the Ukrainians had already done in Crimea against storage houses, S-200s, S-300s, S-400s, all sorts of air defense systems, logistical support for the war, ferries to transport tanks and artillery guns and artillery shells across the water, military targets. I mean, Crimea is a gigantic military base. That's why they wanted, one of many reasons why they wanted to conquer it in the first place. So it being an active target, not that surprising. And their characterization of it being a purposeful targeting of civilians was just dishonest. And then they used that shaky foundation to build a huge argument about how the Ukrainians and the Russians are all basically the same anyway. Like, the morality of this, like, what's really good, what's really evil, and and the way they just behaved around it was so smug. That's just the most recent example. We could go back further and find other examples. Now, I wanted to explicitly say that I don't have that opinion of Grimm, because they're all different hosts, but it was all under the Breaking Points label. And if this was done on mainstream media, I know that alternative media like Breaking Points would call it out endlessly, and so I call it out when they mess it up. Anyway, so I'm not really excited about the platform it's being hosted on. I'm also not super excited that we're watching Vaush and Dave Smith debate it. And maybe it's my recent disenchantment with just how these public debates have gone on Ukraine, but nobody on screen has been to Ukraine. Either the hosts have been to Ukraine, as far as I'm aware, and neither Dave Smith or Vaush have been to Ukraine. None of these people, I would say, specialize in the region. And the people and honestly, I would maybe lean more towards like talking about Ryan Grimm. He at least knows reporters who work at the region. But like Vaush and Dave don't work in the region. They don't know the region particularly well. They just know, I would say, the basics of the conflict enough to debate the bare bones. And even some of the bare bones debating is going to be based in false premises or a lot of surface level knowledge. And I'm not saying that to insult either person. It's just, that's just what it is. Now, Dave Smith, maybe I'm going to be surprised because I've never sat down and watched him debate a full thing on this before, but I'm just generally not happy with the lack of either Ukrainian representation in these debates, or people who have been to Ukraine and have gotten that perspective in these debates to either defend the Ukrainian position in the world or geopolitically, or to argue their position faithfully from their perspective, or to be able to provide that perspective. And nobody here can provide that perspective. That doesn't mean that there's nothing of value that could be discussed. That doesn't mean that there's no points of value. It's just I yearn to hear those perspectives voiced on platforms that have not aired them before, or do not air them regularly. And this is one of those platforms. And so it's hard for me to oversee that lack of value and that thing that I want achieved so bad when I see these debates happening and I see the same points getting hit on again and again and again. That's very aggravating. So it's nothing against any person involved in this individually. It's just, don't like the platform. Platform has a bad record. Don't think I'm going to be hearing a ton of new perspectives today. And it's certainly not a perspective that I think the space desperately needs, which is more people who don't have much knowledge of the country firsthand, or from work, or from personal experience. But you know, that doesn't mean there couldn't be anything of value. So we'll watch it. I'm gonna be legit though. If we get into this and it's just the same old, and we're hitting the same old beats, same old rhythm, I'm not gonna watch an hour and 12 minutes of this. I'm not. We'll see how it goes though. Maybe it'd be interesting. Maybe we'll keep my attention for the whole time. We'll watch as much as we can.
Ukraine is losing.
Oh no, we're gonna skip this. Oh boy. Oh God. I can feel the tenor of the conversation already.
Well, Ukraine is a timely subject to debate right now. Obviously, we're 2+ years into the war, but they're
like, why are these the people on breaking points to debate? I'm sorry. I feel the same thing about a lot of the Piers Morgan stuff. It's just a question that's hitting me in the head more and more and more. It's not that never have these people debate. It's just these are the only types of people that debate these conversations. That's all I mean. Okay, whatever.
been recent escalation.
At least in the alternative media sphere. This unironically is an area where the mainstream media sphere might actually be dominated more. And the mainstream media sphere fails at it dramatically too, but at least they like have connections in Ukraine they can call upon.
And that makes it important, I think, to sort of go through some of those recent developments. For example, the U.S. recently greenlit, as many people know, strikes with U.S. weapons inside of Russia. There was the strike that Russia is blaming the U.S. for in Crimea just over the last couple of days.
I don't want to hear Breaking Points talk about that strike again after they misreported it. I don't want to hear them talk about it again. But this is counterpoints, not breaking points, apparently. I'm just seeing this a different thing in the corner.
I think probably a good way to begin is to give you both kind of an opening statement here. And I'll start with you, Vaush. Should the U.S. continue funding this war? And then we'll go to Dave on the same question. But go ahead first, Vaush.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the idea on a systemic level of rewarding Russia for invading a neighbor. I just think, generally speaking, that's bad for global relations, very destabilizing. I think it's important that we support any system that prevents that from happening, and not exactly a novel position. With regards to the recent development and strikes inside Russian territory, I actually think that this is, in the long run, going to be a good move for peace, just because the previous U.S. doctrine, which seemed to be provide just enough weapons to stall the war, but not like decisively concluded. I think that was actually like the worst possible decision. You know, if Russia did a sort of like early conquest, or if Ukraine decisively held its territory, those both end the war relatively quickly. But just interminably stalling it right at the river, you know, I don't think that would have been good in the long run. Hopefully these increased attacks inside Russian territory, mostly, of course, the refineries that they're using to sort of gin up their war economy. Hopefully that serves as an effective long-term deterrent. I don't want this conflict to continue. I don't want civilians to die. Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll have to see how things play out.
Dave, go ahead.
Well, of course, we should stop funding this. We never should have been funding this war to begin with. I think that in the original Cold War, which I still regard as one of the worst U.S. policies in modern American history, that did so much to ruin our country, and not to mention, you know, like things like the Vietnam War and the millions of people who died in it. But at least in the original Cold War, I think there was always a healthy respect for the risks involved, and that all of us should, all sane people should recognize that the greatest priority in human history is that the United States of America and Russia do not go to war. And this was something that people in the old Cold War were very respectful of and aware of.
Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, this is a norm that developed, but just because the norm exists now doesn't mean the norm should be presupposed. If you asked Curtis LeMay in 1953 his position on war with the Russians, I think it'd be very different than the picture that Dave is painting here. But it is a norm that Lyndon B. Johnson, JFK, through succeeding in handling us through the missile crisis, was able to build up, that nuclear states should not engage in direct war due to the catastrophic consequences of full-blown nuclear war and what it would mean for I could say a number of things, but just the development of human civilization in and of itself. The idea of human civilization being able to develop or even sustain itself at its, I mean, anywhere close to what it is now, because of just how devastating it could be. Now, I don't want to become a fear monger, but I'm just saying that obviously nuclear war would be extremely devastating.
Difference in this new Cold War environment is that no one in the upper echelons of power in America seems to have any respect for this threat.
Man, I feel like me and Dave Smith are on completely, I mean, we just started, but on completely different planets on how we view the Biden administration's reaction to the Russians and their reaction to the threat of nuclear war, with the Biden administration slow rolling every single decision explicitly because of their fear of anything being perceived as escalation, even though many of these decisions would be considered, I mean, yeah, it would make sense that the Ukrainians would strike back at the air bases. Yeah, it makes sense that they would strike the locations that they're being fired upon. Yeah, it makes sense the Ukrainians would launch counterattacks to take back Kharkiv. I remember people saying that, oh my God, the Ukrainians are doing well in the battle for Kharkiv. We got to stop this because it could start World War III. The idea of even the Ukrainians performing well on the battlefield being a risk for World War III. So there was a lot of fear mongering about World War III. And I don't think the Biden administration played into that fear mongering really all the way, as in they're like, oh my God, the whole world's going to explode. But they slow rolled all of these decisions. They slow rolled the providing of Western tanks. They slow rolled the provision of a lot of the air defense stuff like Patriots. They slow rolled the decision to let the Ukrainians shoot back across the border, the being provided with ATACMS to strike bases inside occupied Ukraine itself. That's the Ukrainian territory the Ukrainians controlled literally 2-3 years ago, that the Russians are now attacking them with helicopters from. This slow rolling of the policy was them clearly respecting the threat of escalation, because they wanted to blur possible red lines that they had not probed to see if they were real red lines or not until they were obscured, until then they disappeared to test them. You say you give the Ukrainians a few ATACMS, see how the Russians respond, and then when the Russians don't respond or do anything, which is what they did, then you give them more ATACMS. Now let's say the Biden administration gave the Ukrainians some ATACMS, and then the Russians went full nuclear readiness alert. They said, they could use these to strike Russia itself. We need to put our nuclear weapons on higher alert. We need to shoot down an American jet. Then I'm sure the Biden administration would have proceeded differently. But because they slow walked every advance and they tiptoed forward, it made it hard for the Russians to find a hard cutoff point to say, this is the hard red line where we're going to threaten nuclear war and everything seriously, and not just beat our chest, say, you cross this red line and we will do X, which is something the Russians have been scared to do, because if they draw a red line in the sand and then it gets crossed and then they do nothing, then they destroy their credibility as a nuclear power. But yeah, I'm just saying that I really disagree, because I think the Biden administration, through the way that we've led up to the point where American weapons can be used across the border against Russian attacking troops from Kharkiv, has been slow steps in respect of the Russian nuclear arsenal. It's also the same reason why we don't have troops on the ground. It's the same reason why we have told the Ukrainians not to target port export terminals, which is something that could really destroy and hurt the Russian economy quite a lot for its export market for natural gases and oil and stuff, and crude, stuff like that. There has been other restrictions that the United States has placed out of respect of.
And any respect for, you could think to yourself, well, maybe this will work out in a positive way, that the U.S. is green-lighting attacks inside of Russia. Or perhaps it could be an absolute disaster. And we're playing with, when I say we're playing with fire, it's an understatement. We're flirting with potentially the most disastrous thing that could happen to the human species. If America is to have any role in this conflict, it should be working toward a peaceful negotiation. And in fact, the American role and the Western role has been to kill peaceful negotiations from the beginning of this war and to prolong the fighting. I think that, as John Mearsheimer said back in 2014.
Oh, God. I want to hear what he says about like the prolonging of the war, and it's been our goal to prolong it. We tried to avert it at the start. When it started off, we tried to facilitate conversations to get it off track. But the demands that the Ukrainians and that the West were being met with by the Russians were unacceptable. You cannot invade Ukraine, get your face kicked in for a month, and then demand that Ukraine, in return, on top of taking land and all of this other nonsense, they have to demilitarize to make it so the Russians can invade more easy next time. Like, it's, if you believe in the Mearsheimian fucking bullshit nonsense view that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but I just don't have very much respect for that viewpoint in this war, considering how much it's gotten wrong again and again and again, and how much Mearsheimer has gotten wrong on this war again and again and again. But if that's the view you take, then a state's primary goal is survival. And if a state's primary goal is survival, asking the Ukrainians to demilitarize, as was asked for at the Istanbul framework, I mean, kind of unrealistic.
The West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path has turned out to be the most accurate prediction on this entire conflict. And essentially, I think since the fall of the Soviet Union,
by the way, the idea of like leading down the primrose path leading to this, what happened was during Euromaidan 2014, the Ukrainian protesters came out and protested after the government in the middle of the night against the people's wishes, after he made a commitment to do the opposite, pulled out of the association agreement with the EU. Not, we're going to join the EU, not, we're going to join NATO, we're going to join an association agreement which allows us visa-free travel. But because that association agreement would restrict Ukraine from joining Russia's economic association agreement, and they're joining their economic Eurasian Union, the Russians said, no, we will economically cripple you. They threatened economic coercion and warfare, which they signed a treaty against in the 90s when the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear arsenal, in order to get him to cave in the middle of the night. Protests happened. The government then murdered protesters. The rest is history, right? Now, that's not a leading down the primrose path as much as this is the Russians being unwilling to accept anything but the economic control of Ukraine, the Ukrainians being offered something that would allow them to have association agreement with the EU, get some positives of that, and positives from the Russians that would allow benefits from both sides when joining the EU and joining NATO in and of itself was still not extremely popular. Trying to, you know, Tito did this. Tito played both sides, the West and the East, against each other. Lukashenko, before he, you know, protested against his regime and he got very weak, he did something very similar. And obviously, I'm not saying they should do it in the exact same styles, but the idea that Ukraine could benefit from both relationships was not a completely foreign idea to the Ukrainian population. But the Russians got greedy, as they often have towards the Ukraine. And I think the rest is history. The West was there waiting once the Russians got greedy. That isn't to say that the West wasn't excited about possibly having a strong relationship with Ukraine. Some of them were, but others were terrified. Obama was terrified of the situation they found themselves in 2014. And that's why the most he could ever amount against the Russians was sanctions. Just like we saw fear from American politicians after the invasion in 2008, both due to the election season and how quick it was over. Then we saw from 2014 to 2022, the West generally playing a role of, well, you know, do we really want to anger the Russians this much and that much? I just don't align with them how they're saying we led them down this path as much as the Ukrainians were, through their relationship, their negative relationship with the Russians, edged on this path, and then they kept asking for it, kicking and screaming until this invasion when we said, okay, damn, maybe we actually should consider it seriously. Because, I mean, the Hungarians, the French, the Germans, none of them wanted to join NATO.
American foreign policy, and just keep in mind, American foreign policy in the Clinton administration and in the W. Bush administration and Obama's administration, these are the same people who were in charge of the Middle East. And in fact, the neoconservatives were very focused on NATO expansion back in the 90s. You can go read the Project for a New American Century documents. And the same people who totally blundered foreign policy in the Middle East have totally blundered foreign policy in Europe, provoking Vladimir Putin and the Russians at every turn, leading to this awful place that we're in that is
Poking him at every turn. This is another reason why I don't like this view. It's never like, hey, look, by expanding NATO, it made it much easier for the Russian nationalists argue that there was this creeping anti-Russian force, because NATO's history is definitely not pro-Kremlin, that has creeped forward towards our borders. We feel encroached upon in some way. And that added to an anxiety that fed into pre-existing imperial frameworks that exist in the Russian psyche, that then was used as fuel to fuel their war machine. Like, it's never like, here's a totalist viewpoint. It's, we provoked them at every point. At every point we provoked them. We didn't provoke them in 2014. The Russians provoked that conflict in 2014. We didn't provoke them in 2022. We were no closer to Ukraine joining NATO or the EU in 2022. It was essentially frozen forever. Zelensky was elected on a pro-peace platform. He decided to invest in roads and bridges and infrastructure and some hospitals instead of war making. In fact, when I speak to Ukrainians, I remember I was on Dennis's program with Jake Bro not too long ago. He was like, I like Petro Poroshenko because he wanted to invest in the army much more than Zelensky did. I like Zelensky was not investing in the army. He was somebody who was on the campaign trail talking about negotiating with the Russians. Like, this was the conciliatory position that was being presented to the Russians. It was never, we will give the Russians all of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk for nothing in return, and we will subserve to you. But it was a position of, we will accept the status quo, which indefinitely stopped Ukraine from joining NATO, and they were no closer to joining the EU, and the Russians had their unobstructed military base in Crimea and 1/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk, but it wasn't enough. And now we need to think about, hey, when Donald Trump was debating, and he said, hey, it was Putin told me in private it was his dream to conquer. It's like, wait a second, his dream to conquer Ukraine? So how much is this about provoking NATO? How much of it is this, would it be his dream to conquer if it was just because of NATO? Or does it have to do at all with Putin's extremely nationalist framework? I just want more fair, balanced, and honest framing here. If he wanted to emphasize that, hey, I think it's more of a factor than other people say it is, that'd be one thing. But it's the framing of it. We provoke them at every turn. It ignores so much history, and it centers it as the primary factor starting this war. And which would make people assume that if NATO just went away, then the Russians would just all go home, which is not true. I don't believe it.
Certainly, if you care about the Ukrainians at all, has been more of a disaster for the Ukrainian people than anyone else.
And Dave, Vaush made a point that I think you hear a lot from defenders of U.S. support for the Ukrainian war, and that is, you can't allow other countries, you can't reward other countries for invading other countries. You just can't do that. We can't have that. What's the response to that we can't have that argument?
Well, I mean, first, I would just point out how absurd it is that after the last 20 years of terror wars, somehow the United States of America still gets to put itself in the position of global peacemaker, as if our major concern is that bigger nations can bully smaller nations. I mean, over the last 20 years, there's been no greater purveyor of violence than the United States of America, who has imposed its will on tiny, helpless nations across the world. As far as that, yeah, it's not.
That's true, which is why now we should allow the Russians to dominate Ukraine, which then makes that better or helps somehow. And for me, it's like, oh, what makes us peacemaker? The treaties and agreements we signed. We said, hey, we would help the Ukrainians if they're aggressed upon. We signed a Budapest memorandum. We made them. He just talked about how much he cares about like nuclear policy is, like, for him, it's like the most important. He cares about it so much. The Ukrainians gave up these sovereignty defending weapons to the Russians, the country that would be most likely to invade them if a war was ever to come to Ukraine. Like, the entirety of Ukrainian defense policy should be defined around stopping the one neighbor that could actually possibly invade them again. And this is the weapon that could stop them from doing it. And they gave it up after we said we'd make them pariahs if they didn't. Because we wanted these nuclear weapons to be confined after the Soviet Union fell apart to one country so they'd be much easier to gather and control. So let's say some corrupt army officer doesn't sell off 500 nuclear bombs to some terror group, and then we have skyscrapers going up like mushroom clouds, or any other number of terror scenarios that people thought of that made many Western diplomats terrified for the collapse of the Soviet Union. People don't know about, but yes, there was a lot of fear about the collapse of the Soviet Union. While many Americans don't remember it, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians do. But it's just, if there's so much respect for it, then shouldn't there be a respect for that sacrifice, a defense of that sacrifice? It can't be the most important thing ever is stopping nuclear war, and then this country gives up nuclear weapons in pursuance of non-proliferation, and this is not our business anymore. We don't have to do anything with this. Well, if it's the most important thing in the world, then certainly we should be steadfast in our agreements. We shouldn't make people think, hey, you give up your nukes and your country will be invaded, conquered, and destroyed. Or, hey, the only way you can guarantee your sovereignty is with nukes. Or, hey, if you invade your neighbors and get your teeth kicked in, don't worry. As long as you can act like a nuclear suicide bomber, then everything will be okay in the long run. I don't like any of these scenarios.
Not good that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And yes, certainly that's something we don't want to see. My argument would be that America and the West more broadly had many opportunities, many off-ramps to put this fire out or at least calm it down. And at every single turn, poured more gasoline on this fire.
Man, we are just completely two different worlds. There's certain things where I could say where we can, we should have been more proactive when the Russians were in economic decay. The problem is many of the things that I would prescribe, he would say would be the exact wrong thing to do. Like a more aggressive response after 2008, or after the 2014 invasion of Crimea, when the Russians say they aren't our soldiers, be like, oh, if they're not your soldiers, then it doesn't matter if we reclaim it back for Ukraine because they're not your soldiers. So it doesn't, and making it clear to the Russians that even if it ends up with them controlling Crimea, it would go no further than that. There would be no 8 years of frozen conflict in the Donbass, or just calling a conference, to call it the Budapest Conference, to follow up on the Budapest Memorandum, to be like, we have to settle this here. You have to leave Ukraine. We guaranteed the yada yada yada. How about we sign a treaty guaranteeing no nuclear weapons deployment in Ukraine? There's certain things that I would agree to here, but all of these would also take a certain backing of Ukraine that I don't think Dave Smith would be agreeable to. And all of the ways that I feel that to get to the position he would want, which I would see as abandoning Ukraine, America would have to act in a very, I would say, snaky type of way, a very snaky, slithery type of, we made this agreement, never mind, we don't want to do it anymore now that you've given up the thing that we wanted you to give up. Now that you've already given up all your leverage, we don't care anymore. Bye-bye. I feel reinforcing the worst image of our country.
Ultimately resulted in the invasion in 2022.
Yeah, so Vaush, how can the U.S. say with a straight face that it's not okay for other countries to invade smaller countries?
Well, I think it's kind of a cowardly non-argument, because I'm not arguing in favor of the moral superiority of the United States. That'd be a ridiculous position for me to take. It's not football. We're not taking sides.
By the way, in this war, I do think the United States is morally superior in this conflict, but that doesn't mean that America is in of itself a morally superior state all around compared to other states above them all. For example, the Russians can be wrong on a whole bunch of things and still have been right if they were, say, backing up the Armenians and saying, hey, you know what? We shouldn't just have everybody from Nagorno-Karabakh ethnically cleansed. Let's actually have a settlement that will respect the people who were displaced. I wouldn't have came out and said, the Russians are evil. It's impossible for them to ever do anything good. So screw the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, screw the Armenians, screw this, screw that. Basing it purely in just my distaste for Russian fascism, authoritarianism, or any dislikes I have that any of the many gifts the Ruski Mir has given Eastern Europe. That I think it would be dishonest for me to do that, because at the end of the day, the conflict and the side should be judged on its merits. And I think the merits when it comes to the war in Ukraine are very easy to judge. And so, America could hypothetically be wrong on literally every other foreign policy conflict in history. That isn't the case, but assuming that it was, and it could be correct here. Stalin was wrong on many things. I assume Dave would agree. I assume Mr. Ryan Smith would agree. I assume blonde woman would agree. I don't know her name. I'm very sorry. I assume Miss Glasses would agree. But Stalin was right to fight Hitler. Like, if I was to just point to every other bad thing Stalin did and said, oh, look, Stalin did all these bad things, and now you're telling me that it's right to fight this war against the Hitler guy, Mr. Funny Mustache, you want me to take that stuff seriously? It'd be stupid, because I'm just making an appeal to, like, oh, there's been previous mistakes in foreign policy, so this one's also probably a mistake. Roll curtains, roll credits.
Sides like, waving banners. There are two levels to this when it comes to agency. We're concerned about the broader socioeconomic and geopolitical context that led to where we are now. And that goes back to the Cold War and even earlier. If we listen to Putin's justifications for the invasion, it goes back to the borders of the Russian Empire, And then there's like the immediate decision making. We must.
Prince Yaroslav's horse taking a shit in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Remove agency from the equation. Russia invaded, by Putin's own words, in a sort of territorial land grab. The idea that it was entirely because of a response to Western aggression.
I will say, again, I would be taking people like Dave so much more credibly and on their face if I saw that same disdain for empire building projected upon the Russians before justifying their action with, well, they were provoked this way, that way, this way, that way. I understand they're debating two sides of a debate, but for people who genuinely like support Ukraine, or for people who have been following this war very closely, closely as in person, it would go a long way into convincing them of being like, well, maybe it isn't the best path forward for the Ukrainians, because it makes it seem like it's more than just like another jerk-off session to say how the federal government sucks.
Or NATO posturing is ridiculous and ahistorical. But that doesn't mean the West isn't responsible for helping to create the situation we're in now. We have to balance these two justifications. Our arrogance after the end of the Cold War, the fact that rather than reaching out to Russia as a potential future ally, we ostracized, with the shock therapy, the sort of economic devastation of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states. These contributed to an environment in which future conflict was inevitable. It was reprehensible on the part of the Western governments to participate in this. Look today at the divide between former West and Eastern Germany. I mean, the reason that East Germany is voting so heavily for the AfD is in large part because they see it as a rejection of the doctrine of the West that left them behind after reunification. These should all be taken into account. And we must acknowledge that Putin is a fascist who did a territorial land grab. Those two facts don't contradict each other. They work together to create a complete narrative. With regards to the invasion now, I agree we have to take the threat from Russia seriously. And by that, I mean, we don't want this to scale out infinitely. We don't want this to turn into a global war. That's something we have to take seriously. At the same time, we have to acknowledge Russia does too. And their constant threats of nuclear war, the fact that they started this invasion, the fact that they have been posturing and acting aggressive towards Finland.
We got to get more creators and people who are pro-Ukraine basing their argument on the Budapest Memorandum. And I know the Budapest Memorandum comes up, but when people bring up the threat of nuclear war and how important it is, the counterpoint should be, then Ukraine's sacrifice of nuclear weapons should be all that more respected, since you know of their significance and the sacrifice it made for both their security, our security, and everyone's security. I mean, it's something I see brought up very little. And when you have somebody saying like, yeah, I guess screw that old agreement, I like the only response I've really received from libertarians on it is, well, I don't like it, so I don't think we should have signed it. Therefore, I don't think we should respect the agreement which they've already paid their full dividends on, but we haven't.
Finland towards the Baltic states.
And also, if that is the case, that we're just going to completely abandon it and take the approach, if the Ukrainians keep fighting, we're just going to abandon them. Could we really say they shouldn't start an illegal nuclear weapons program in secret? And people might think like, I mean, how could they really do that? I mean, I don't know. They're full of a ton of old Soviet scientists who work on the nuclear weapons. I mean, you don't think it's possible? If North Korea could do it, you don't think Ukraine could?
even like ramping up aggression towards the rest of Western Europe, we must consider again their agency. Now, I think that in the long run, there is a very deleterious consequence to creating an incentive structure where Putin gets to boost his national rep, his prestige, with a successful land grab in Ukraine. I think it would have been disastrous if he could have just marched west and taken the territory, because it would have reaffirmed and rewarded all the worst possible behaviors from him. That doesn't mean I think that we should sort of do a victory lap around Russia. You know, Cold War II, let's win, let's trounce them in Ukraine. I do think that we're in a tough situation because we can't just like magically make Russia, I guess, a democracy or a country less incentivized to invade its neighbors or reclaim historical territory. It's a difficult question, which is why I don't like simple answers.
So, Dave, actually, here's an interesting point that Vaush just raised about the beginning of the war. And
by the way, like when people talk about like the disaster of American involvement in the Middle East, very little of it starts at the Gulf War, when we stopped Saddam from invading Kuwait and pushed him out. In fact, if our involvement just was like Gulf War and then we just kind of like moved out of the region, it was like a double containment policy forever. I mean, the entire framework of like the last 20, 30 years of Middle East policy would be completely different, would be completely transformed. And maybe we wouldn't view it as much of a disaster. But what is distinctive about the Kuwait War and why most Americans after it was like, oh yeah, I guess we won, woohoo. It's not viewed as this massive tragedy. It was not only due to the fact we didn't take massive losses, it was also due to the fact it was provoked by an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait that was internationally condemned on basically every level. They had no legal basis for, and I mean, they were completely, the world was in the moral right to throw them out of Kuwait. That doesn't mean that everything that happened during the Kuwait War was morally right, etc., but that there was a moral right for the people who lived there to want the Iraqis gone. And so I don't really think, judging all of these conflicts, where we decide we're going to invade Iraq, we're going to depose the regime and create a totally new regime, or we're going to go into Afghanistan and we're going to fight in Afghanistan to establish a new government because we don't want the Al-Qaeda bases being who have allied themselves with the Taliban to be operating from here, and we got to make this whole government from scratch. We don't have to do that in Ukraine. We just have to supply a country within its full legal right, where our invasion of Iraq, when it comes to the crime of aggression, legal is not the first word I would use. Full legal right to support Ukraine against its aggressive neighbor, invading it with defensive weapons. And the defensive weapons are being talked about here as the escalatory nature of American support. When we said we would support them in the 90s, and the Russians knew this, for 30 years, if the scenario was to happen. To compare these two wars or conflicts, or, oh, the disaster of Middle East involvement mirrors the disaster of involvement in Ukraine, they're just, I think these are just impossible to compare. The circumstances are too different, the regions are different, the provoking circumstances of the war are different, and I just don't like the comparisons, because it just boils down to America involved in world, too aggressive, no. It's too, world's too complicated to boil it down to everything's the Middle East.
You know, if we may all agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that we all think it would have been bad if Putin had indeed marched into Kiev and took all of Ukraine, etc. But that leads us to the question, Dave, of how much U.S. involvement, if any, was just. If we agreed that it was good for the U.S. to perhaps prevent the Russian capture of Kiev, etc., at what point did it become too much? At what point is the support no longer just or moral? How do you respond to that, Dave?
I think that the point that you could start at a lot of different points. I think the first round of NATO expansion was unjust and was unnecessarily provocative of the Russians. Let me just, I'm not exactly sure what Vaush is referring to as like a cowardly non-argument.
By the way, a question I would love to ask someone like Dave is like, okay, if NATO never expanded, but we still had the Budapest Memorandum and the Russians still invaded, should we have supported them? Because I have a feeling that his libertarian framework would still come to the conclusion of no, which then, to me, almost makes the whole conversation like null and void. Like, instead, we should just then debate the morality of any involvement overseas ever, even when the circumstances are just. Like that should be the conversation, like centering in on that.
Was directly responding to Ryan's point. If you have a serial,
because it's just like, again, it's his over like concentration on NATO expansion as the primary provoking factor. Like the Bulgarians joined NATO because they were invaded of Russian expansionism. So there was a pre-existing fear that NATO was there to provide an answer for in the instability that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the communist regimes, and the Yugoslav civil wars, when Europe was like, oh snap, war back on the European continent, oh my goodness. And so people ran to NATO, and the countries that had a historical relationship and being fucked over by the Russians had a higher want to go to NATO. But even if we destroyed NATO, what if wouldn't another defensive alliance inevitably have taken its place? Like maybe it would have just been a pan-European defensive alliance, but it's kind of hard. I mean, if you are a realist of the Mearsheimer type, which he is citing, I don't know if he's a defensive realist or an offensive realist. I don't know what type of realist Dave is. But if he believes that states will counterbalance the way that many realists do, then naturally defensive alliance forming like NATO would be the natural reaction to the largest country in the world deciding, oh, I need to get a little bit larger,
killer who's killed far more people than another serial killer, and they claim that they're trying to stop a serial killer because they're so against killing. It's reasonable to point out that no, this is in fact not what's motivating U.S. foreign policy, that no, the butcherers of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and Libya and
I would say Assad was the main butcher of Syria. I assume he's just going to talk about like Operation Timber Sycamore, but like if you look at the death tolls, it's like overwhelmingly Assad. Like people could say, well, we ship weapons to rebels. Yeah, that's true. But that rebellion was happening with us or without us. I mean, maybe Assad would have put down the rebellion quicker and then just fought with ISIS more. I don't know, but like Assad was like the main butcher in Syria.
Yemen are not actually motivated by some sense of we can't let big guys pick on little guys. Let's have an honest conversation about what's really motivating this policy.
But like Vaush's point wasn't about like, is America's true values that the big guys can't pick on the little guys. Vaush was saying, completely irrespective of the hypocrisy or the morality of it, it is a bad thing for countries like Russia to pick on states like Ukraine. And I would add, especially if they're in the gates of Europe, with our largest per capita trading partners. I mean, our main export market is Europe. And I hate to be an America-centric guy here, but as an American, it would be really bad if that market was to go kerplunk or investor confidence. And look, point is, it'd be really bad if Europe was to go into chaos due to continued Russian aggression, or for us to get involved in a war due to a continued Russian aggression. Stopping them in Ukraine can have many motivations, irrespective of who is the good guy or the bad guy, or what's within the morality of what's America's true intentions. America could naturally, through the ecosystem of interacting states, do something that's beneficial for the world, even if it's not of their own self-interest. Like, I don't know why I'm on a Stalin roll today. Stalin, out of his own self-interest for survival, could want to fight Adolf Hitler, irrespective of whether or not there was other good reasons to fight Adolf Hitler, which many, right? But like for me, the motivations matter less here. I mean, they can matter when it comes to, okay, how will America interact with Ukraine once this is over? Will they act with 100% their best interests at heart? Like that's the type of stuff it would matter for analyzing. But when it comes to the statecraft itself, like states act within their own interest. I mean, is Mearsheimer realist?
And it has been since the collapse of the Soviet Union to increase the power of the American empire. And Russia has always been seen as a force that's outside of the American empire. That's what's been motivating American foreign policy. This is what we're living through here is largely the neoconservative doctrine. It was the worst thing that ever happened in the history of our country is that after we became probably the first ever true global superpower, about 10 years later, the neoconservatives got control of our foreign policy. And this was their plan from the very beginning. So no, I don't think America should have been involved in Ukraine at all. And I certainly don't.
Okay, so that he doesn't believe. Okay, so after Budapest Memorandum signed, his plan would just be, I guess, but I've heard this from other libertarians, just kind of like cut tail and run.
think that that anything we've done has done anything except make this situation much worse and much more dangerous, because now you are experiencing a proxy war with the two biggest nuclear superpowers.
By the way, Ukrainians hate it when Westerners say proxy war. Like, generally speaking, from their perspective, from what has been told to me, they don't like it because it feels like when the war is framed primarily as a proxy war, then it takes away their agency, their sovereignty, and the decisions that they have made consciously in defense of their own nation, and the sacrifices they have made consciously, to turn them into puppets who do not fight for the homeland or survival, but for Washington, which is not appreciated. There's another thing he said here I wanted to respond to. What was it?
This situation
the idea that we have done nothing to make the situation any better. Whether it comes to the propping up of the electrical grid, whether it comes to air defense protecting civilians, whether it came to the weapons sending over helping liberate the people of Kherson or the people around Kharkiv, or allowing them to hold the line as the Russians continue to make crazy territorial demands, with just 2 weeks ago Putin calling for more land and expanding his territorial control to a territory on top of what he's already conquered that would be the size of Taiwan, roughly. Or the crazy continued demands of demilitarization based upon the Istanbul framework. Like, these things you ask the Ukrainians, they have a very different perspective than. Now, Dave could, I guess, say that, well, I know better than what the Ukrainians would want I know better than Ukrainians about what's good for them. And what's good for them is not weapons. What good for them would be giving up this land or doing whatever is necessary, including sacrificing freedom, civil liberties, economic control of their resources for, Russians. That's their perspective, and that's his, I guess.
Reducing things down to simplistic worldview, and
I don't know. I felt Dave's view is pretty simplistic so far. I mean, Vaush's is also kind of simplistic, but Dave's is also simplistic. Just simplistic in different ways. What's wrong with being simple?
Of course, Vaush, you kind of snuck a straw man in there. I wouldn't say that this conflict is entirely because of NATO expansion.
It's just the only thing he's mentioned up to this point and all he ever talks about.
But to pretend like that's not a major driving factor in this.
Yeah, that's 100% where I disagree with. I think it is a driving factor, but I think it is like 1 amongst 10. And it's certainly not more significant than, say, like if what Trump said is true about how Putin talked about conquering Ukraine, then how can we completely just say that ideology didn't play a significant factor here? The problem is, though, while Dave himself might be like, okay, I guess ideology, imperial views, their views of the Ukrainian people, their views of Ukraine. I mean, like, when Putin had like a blank slate to describe the war with Tucker Carlson, he went on like a 1-hour autistic like Reddit rant about history and like Yaroslav the Wise Horse, all this nonsense that would make me believe, okay, I think this actually matters to him. This like crazy history stuff actually matters to him. Legacy matters to an over 70-year-old decrepit dictator. I mean, it's not too surprising. He's not too crazy. He's written essays about it. He made a speech about it at the start of the war. But I barely see that mentioned as a motivating factor by alternative media commentators trying to delve into Mearsheimer thought.
Conflict is to not be dealing with reality. And this has been admitted by all of the top people on both sides. And this was why so many people within the national security apparatus in the 90s opposed the first round of NATO expansion, explicitly because this will provoke a reaction from the Russians. Through the years, the Russians have been crystal clear that Ukraine was their red line.
No, they didn't. I mean, second. Here's a statement from Putin. Here it is. 2002. I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the process of expanding interaction with NATO and Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the Ukraine-NATO Council. At the end of the day, the decision on Ukraine joining NATO is to be made by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter of those two partners. Now that was on. Now, okay, that was in what I think that was in May of 2002. But 2 weeks later, he said again on the topic of Ukraine's accession to NATO. This was from a Russian press service joint press conference. The Russian president said that it was entitled to make the decision independently. He does not see it as something that could cloud the relations between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, like, I could go through some other statements he's made, and like the relationship Putin had with NATO and Russia's had with NATO has evolved and changed. Their relationship, the amount of aggression they've shown towards states that have thought about joining NATO or even the EU has changed, and it devolved and got worse and worse and worse and worse until in 2014, where even not even joining the EU, just joining the association agreement, which wasn't even part of NATO, just part of the EU, was so frowned upon that the Russians were willing to try to destroy the Ukrainian economy in order to stop them from getting visa-free travel with EU countries, so they could force the Ukrainians to join their economic association agreements, their economic arrangement instead. So Dave Smith is just entirely wrong here. They have never always said this is a red line. I mean, within 20 years ago, the same leader in charge of Russia was saying something totally different. And this was also at the same period when NATO was expanding, when these comments would actually have had an impact.
Thanks to the greatest journalist of the 21st century, the hero Julian Assange, who is thankfully now a free man, we know that the current head of the CIA, Burns.
Hey. No, don't throw shade.
Told Condoleezza Rice this explicitly, that this was a red line, and not a red line in the way that America makes up red lines. Like Obama will say, if Assad uses a certain type of weapon on his people, that's a red line for us. It's all just ridiculous. This is a red line in a true sense, in the sense that Jack Kennedy said.
He's like really digging his heels in here after building the false premise. But let me also say, the Russians have red lines like that all the time. Western weapons breaking into Russia was a red line. Did it happen? Guess what's happened? Fucking nothing, right? Western tanks, red line. Western jets, red line. I mean, like large amounts of Western support, period, red line. I mean, like, does the military contractors agreement that was just made cross the red line of Western troops? I don't know. I guess that's up to the Russians to determine, but I haven't seen a reaction yet, so I guess that wasn't a red line. I mean, like, what is and what isn't a red line here, right?
Putting nuclear missiles in Cuba is a red line for us. We will blow up the world if you.
Yeah, but the Russians have not said, if Ukraine takes back Zaporizhia, we will blow up the world. If the Ukrainians take back Donetsk, we will blow up the world. There's been a lot of chest beating and hooting and hollering, you know, a hit dog hollers, as they say, but they have not drawn a red line in the sand. If this military operation is successful, we will introduce nuclear weapons to the battlefield. They don't make those hard commitments because if they didn't deliver upon them once that line was crossed, say Western weapon hitting inside of Russia, then they would completely destroy their credibility and then be forced into starting a war that they couldn't win. Really, it's hard to imagine anyone winning, but they certainly wouldn't win, or backing off and destroying their nuclear credibility, which is a lose-lose situation. If the West doesn't back down, it'd be a massive gamble on their part, one they have not been willing to make.
Try to do that. Vladimir Putin, and as Burns pointed out, not just Vladimir Putin, the entire Russian establishment has been unanimous on this, that they will not tolerate Ukrainian entry to NATO. And look, it's not justified.
The thing is, when we have this conversation, can we just throw out there, Ukraine was not joining NATO in 2022. Ukraine was not joining NATO in 2014. Germany, Hungary, France, so many different countries, Turkey, are not down with them joining NATO.
Is occurred.
Hey, thank you, Road RR, for the $2. Free Muslims in Iberia. Thank you for the $2, but free Muslims. I am not a man who will take a Muslim for free.
Or reasonable for Vladimir Putin to have launched this war, but on the scale of geopolitical demands, the demand that Ukraine cannot be a part of the American empire's military alliance was a fairly reasonable one, and we could have avoided this whole war by just committing to that.
I have a quick follow-up on that, Dave. So
Sure.
all
Yeah, and this comment from Dave to me is just like immensely ignorant, because not only is it a commitment to something he could not know, he's proposing like hypotheticals he would not be able to think out. He's framing this entirely based upon the Russians invaded Ukraine because of us. If we simply did not expand NATO, then the Ukrainians and the Russians would have gotten along. They would have, like, nationalist sentiment in Russia would not have gotten higher. They wouldn't have seeked domination of their neighbors. But what confuses me about this is that, I mean, if he's a Mearsheimer realist and he believes that all states naturally try to maximize power, and if he's an offensive realist, the Mearsheimer type, then he's a power maximizer, then why would the Russians not do it? Wouldn't the Russians just see a power vacuum to be filled? This is why the Bulgarians joined NATO. Why wouldn't they invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? Like right after the Soviet Union collapsed, they invaded Chechnya twice. They invaded Moldova. They invaded Georgia in 2008. Like, and many of these invasions and wars happened before NATO expansion. Like, it's the idea that their wars and conquests and nationalist sentiment would all be just subdued if NATO either went away or stayed at its borders before the collapse of the Soviet Union is a guarantee that Dave is making that he cannot confidently make his viewers if he was being honest with them. So I disagree with this wholeheartedly. Like, Putin opened the war by making like he wrote essays about it, talking about how Ukraine belongs to Russia. And if what Trump is saying about their private conversation is true, I mean, the evidence just builds.
Things, we're dealing in the reality that we did push for the NATO expansion in 2014 and all of that considered. Is your position that there should have been like basically zero aid, military, whatever else, government aid to Ukraine after?
Man, I wish Vaush could argue these points, but I mean, like, again, I don't want to blame Vaush too much, because this is like, just, if you're not having people in the room who are like deeply familiar with the conflict having these debates, then you're not going to get into these nuances, and these types of things are going to slip through. I mean, that could have been the whole problem Breaking Points had with the Crystal and Sagar segment on the Crimea strikes. Just, they didn't have anybody in the room who's even like a military expert, former military, or has been following the strikes on Crimea particularly closely, to catch them and say, like, wait a second, this is not true what you're saying. It's just the style of guests that they didn't invite. Lewis Hinesmith donated $20 and said, NATO only expands by countries making and being approved by the alliance. That is true. NATO does not expand by invading and conquering. It is voluntary.
NATO only expands by countries making and being approved by the alliance.
That is true. Now, whether or not it comes from a parliamentary vote of the people every time is, different question. Because sometimes the parliament itself votes and not the people going out and voting in referendum. But the point is, though, that the country, its legislative head, its government has to agree to NATO joining. Yes.
The invasion a couple of years back, like basically just none.
Absolutely. If there was any role for the Americans to play, it would have been trying to negotiate an end to the war. Unfortunately, if you're putting me in the hypothetical of like,
hey, we should have talked harder. Thank you. Brilliant. Like, I just like negotiate to end the war when this war has been going on for so long. Like, what does that mean? Like, so many people have tried. So many people have tried the different frameworks, Minsk 1, 2, whatever. Like, it's just, what we should have done is negotiated. We did negotiate. We negotiated multiple times.
You can't change anything before this, but you're already here. We had probably blown all of that goodwill, and there were better parties who would have been more suited for that. For example, going back to even the Bucharest summit in 2008 into the beginning of the Maidan Revolution, Germany was much more...
Maidan? What did he call it? Maidan?
The beginning of the Maidan Revolution.
Okay. I've never heard it referred to as Maidan, but maybe my pronunciation has been wrong. It's possible. Maybe I'm just ignorant. Thank you for the $2, Michael. conflation of coup for democracy with NATOism. I don't know what that's in reference to, but thank you for the $2. I don't know what he means. Like, we could have done something different during Maidan. What could we have done different? Because we wanted them to make a deal with the government. We asked them to make a deal with the government. And the protesters said, screw you. The government needs to resign now. They've killed 100 of our people. We're not dealing with this. They've sent gangs to go beat us up. I mean, this is like if Joe Biden hired MS-13 gangsters to go beat up and murder libertarians, I don't know if Dave Smith would be as like conciliatory. Like, I don't know. See, this is, hey, let's have a Ukrainian who was at Euromaidan in this conversation discussing like, oh, what could have America done differently to soothe the Russians during Maidan? After Maidan, the Ukrainian government got in office and said, hey, Russia, we will negotiate with you a continuation of your lease in the Crimean port. They were willing to continue to allow Russians to stay in the port of Crimea. That was not enough. They wanted all of Crimea. And so they invaded while lying about it the whole time.
Germany was much more hesitant to get involved, to go down this path. There were other European countries who were kind of like, hey, let's not provoke the Russians. It's part of the—
And how is Germany's foreign policy towards the Russians now widely considered in Europe? Is it a positive thing, how people remember Merkel's policy towards the Russians? Or do they see it as an unprepared, short-sighted decision for economic benefit?
The reason why Ukraine didn't get a full map invitation in 2008 is the objection of the Germans. So probably someone else would have been better at it. Yes, essentially what I'm saying is that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, the most war—
Okay, this is like the third or fourth time he said this. Is this like a thing he just repeats every 4 minutes to just remind everybody that America's done many bad things, and so you should expect them to do bad things every time, all the time? Hate your country's bad? What it feels like.
War-hungry country in the world, the United States of America.
The most warmongering country in the world, or war-hungry country in the world?
Purveyor of violence in the world, the most war-hungry country in the world.
Most war-hungry country in the world. My God. So, mind you, America is the most powerful country in the world. They have troops, they can put troops anywhere or planes anywhere in a very short period of time, aircraft carriers. We have the most means to make war. And so when we make war, it has an impact, and we're probably not too feeling of consequences in the same way that, say, North Korea would.
Whenever I hear this argument, I always want to ask, did NATO expansion force Russia to invade Moldova 1992, Georgia 1992, Chechnya 1994, etc.?
No, it didn't. It didn't force them. There was other things at play. They wanted control of the region. They didn't just want to be Russia dealing with Russia's affairs. Russia believes that this area's, and many of the Russian political elite, including Yeltsin, believe that this is like their backyard, so they get to determine the affairs. The problem is that they're the largest country in the world, so their backyard touches tons of different countries.
World, the United States of America shouldn't have been the ones at the table at all, and there might have been some goodwill from other parties who had more of an interest.
Again, if he believes truly what he said about nukes earlier, then we would have an interest about how those Soviet nukes get distributed after the war too. I mean, after the Cold War.
To avoid this catastrophe.
And if I may, I just... There are elements of this that I guess don't make sense to me. First of all, the claim that America's decision-making is based on...
I don't know what is this like a Vaush says that line a lot. Do not make sense to me.
Elements of this that I guess don't make sense to me. First of all, the claim that America's decision-making is based on it trying to expand its own geopolitical power rather than any altruistic interest. That's true, but that's also the case for all countries. That's basic IR theory. So the idea of like, well, this
well, that's when we say that's basic IR theory, that's specific. That's a specific area of IR theory and belief about certain whatever. Is he talking about power maximizing or just like security ensuring? Like there's different whatever. Okay, I don't know how deep of a grasp either of these people have on IR. And even I'm not a professor in IR either. I study it mostly recreationally.
On theory of America expanding its interest. That should
eventually I'll go back to college once the war is over.
Just nation states. Russia's doing that right now. India's doing that. China's doing that. Everyone's doing that. We're better at it because we're a superpower, of course. But that's like a fundamental rule of national like exchange. I don't think that it's really a moral question. It's a matter of material conditions in a basic Marxist sense. Who's motivated by what and where they are. In the modern world, you know, the imperial sphere of influence extends to the entire planet. You know, American jets can reach any part of the world in 24 hours. Everyone's can if they have jets. There's no we get the nation next to us, which makes me think the idea.
Not everyone's jet can reach anywhere. The Russians have like one aircraft carrier and it's garbage. It constantly catches on fire. I don't even know if it's still seaworthy. Those things really do help enable you to deploy your jets anywhere quicker. I mean, I guess you could, like, with the troop arrangement and agreement, you could deploy your jets like in like the Bahamas if you get their approval. I just don't know what he means by that. You got a lot more range than you used to, I think is the point. But
that like Ukraine is more innately in the Russian sphere of influence is, I think it's a little bit old hat. At the end of the day, the people in Ukraine were interested in closer.
Man, I'm gonna be honest. Like, Vaush is going about. I don't even know what advice to give because Vaush is just going about this like totally different than how I would. I mean, the points that I would be hitting on right now, historical arguments, I'd be talking about his concern for nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, and you know how helping defend Ukraine helps reaffirm nuclear non-proliferation and the sacrifices of those states who help make sacrifices for global security at the expense of their own security. Like, anyway, whatever.
Relations with the EU. And that is ultimately what triggered everything from Euromaidan, Yanukovych fleeing the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of the Donbass following the invasion of Ukraine broadly. This is, again, a complicated situation. I don't mean to detract from the influence that Western arrogance had in it. I would never try to do that. But I do think that, like, your roadmap for how things should have progressed from an American perspective following the 2022 invasion is misguided, because I don't think the world would be any farther from annihilation if Russia had simply marched westward, taken Kiev, and we had a bunch of ginned up Russian soldiers right up against the border of Poland, you know, having just successfully annexed former Soviet/Russian imperial territory.
I mean, we have the largest country in Europe annexing the second largest country in Europe.
You could
probably would not. Yeah, it's probably not the best thing for stability.
Imagine the propaganda coming out of the Kremlin about how they're reuniting their people. They're sort of like expanding the Russian interest in like a Duginist ethnic sense, you know, reclaiming the empire. I think that like the incentive structure behind that would be really bad. Like that, you're basically you're throwing chum into the water for sharks. You know, Putin is expansionist. He's been sort of like preempting this for a long time with Georgia. You know, his behavior with the Chechens. I don't think that that would bring us any closer to peace. Now, is the current path we're on right now the best possible road? Obviously not. Nothing we ever do is the best possible road, but I think it's closer to threading that line than just letting them march westward with Ben.
I just don't understand how Dave really could control for all of his factors to say if we didn't expand NATO, then there would have been no, after a great collapse in the Soviet Union, where extremists are going to be, as people are desperate, listen to more. Russian irredentism, revanchism couldn't swing its ugly head around and justify invading Ukraine, because Putin justifies this war through irredentist lens almost primarily when talking to the Russian public, right? When talking to Westerners, it might be a little different. He'll still include that too, but I mean, irredentism dominates it. So I just can't understand Dave's perspective.
I'm interested in, I guess, is practical solutions now, outside of just letting Ukraine get annexed, which I really don't think would have been good for world peace in the long run, even if it would have quickly ended the conflict. How do we incentivize?
Well, no, when we say that too, by the way, like the United Kingdom invading Ireland during the Troubles, people would say, oh, well, it quickly ended the conflict. Yeah, it quickly ended the invasion. It didn't quickly end the conflict necessarily. It would just mean the Troubles would have been like 10 times harder and more deadly and larger, and more people would have been involved, and more money and weapons would have been involved. If Russia did what they did in Bucha the same way they did it in 2022, on top of all of the previous like negative emotions they've inspired amongst the Ukrainian public, I think we'd see a lot of car bombings. In fact, we already see car bombings in occupied territory. It would just be everywhere in the main form of resistance, and where everybody would outlet their anger, or many people would outlet their anger to. Like, I think people immediately assuming that like an end to like formal declarations of war necessarily translates into peace, I think is, it is a lovely and would be hoped for assumption, but not necessarily true.
Ukraine and Russia to come to the table and bring an end to this war? Can Ukraine regain its lost territory? I think morally it should be able to, because I don't like nations being rewarded for annexing adjacent territory. But logistically, can they? Would it be possible to end things where they are now? Would Russia keep Crimea and that just be seen as a kind of like dull historical injustice to fade away over time? And 100 years from now, people would be like, did you know Crimea used to be Ukraine? I don't know. There's so much dogmatism. And whenever you bring up like modern solutions, people go back to, I don't know, the end of the Cold War. I understand NATO is not exactly a global force for good, but what can we do now? I mean, I so rarely hear answers that are contextualized in the current moment.
Sure. Can I respond to that? Because there's a few that I want to answer your question at the end there, but just like a few things I want to point out. Number one, I think this is almost like bigger than just any political debate. There's it's a broader theme in life in general. I think anybody who's married, who's on the show or listening to the show knows this is true in personal relationships. There's a tendency to, if you're in an argument with your wife or your husband or something like that, to focus on what they did and what they did that's bothering you. But a much more healthy posture, if you're in a successful relationship, is that you also add in like, okay, well, what am I doing? How am I participating?
Well, the problem here, though, is he's taking the perspective to a certain degree from if he was the Ukrainians, or if he was in Europe here making defense policy, of the battered wife. Justifying actions like, well, I mean, that pasta was undercooked. I mean, he had the problem. It would be one thing if he was healthily analyzing the mistakes of the United States or the West in dealing with the Russians, whether it be during the Yeltsin era, in the enabling of like actions in Transnistria, or a lack of investment or cooperation during the times of economic chaos during the Clinton administration, whether it would be certain deals that were made between Yeltsin and Clinton, like all these specifics. He could like adjust and move around, and we could talk about any of that. But when he says, if we didn't expand NATO, this war wouldn't have happened, this is delusion. Like, he cannot say that for certain. And so that's not healthy skepticism and saying, oh, well, that's me not doing the finger pointing. That's a lack of finger pointing. That is entirely putting the blames on us and ignoring the ultra nationalistic claims of greater Russia coming from the Kremlin. It is naive about Russia's interest. It is naive about what the Russians believe. And it is naive about what the Russians are willing to take back territory.
In this, what have I done that's kind of led to this situation? Generally speaking, I think that if you look at the corporate media, you're going to hear all of this talk about what Putin's done. And I think a lot of times in these debates, people can kind of claim to be like, well, I have a more nuanced position. I'm not simplifying things. I think the point of saying that, like,
his thing is simple, though. It's, if we just did expand NATO, there'd be no war. It's just
well, all governments are expansionist by nature, so there's no difference between the neoconservatives and, say, other groups of people. I don't know.
So he doesn't take the Mearsheimian domestic policy view of realism. Rod R. Free the Europeans in Russia? I don't know what that means. I care about the reindeer herders and the people in Tuva just as much as I care about anybody else in Russia. Human being. Anyway, where were we talking about? Back to this.
I'm not saying they're the same, but like a logical analogy, it's like, oh, well, all governments kill people. So like what Adolf Hitler's doing is just kind of the same as other governments. It's not exactly true. It's kind of different in scale and in kind. To sit here and say, and look, if we have time, we could go through the history of Chechnya and Georgia and all this stuff. But
to be clear, though, if what he's saying is true there, Mearsheimer's belief, like when we talk about like Ukraine, what would be better for Ukraine's development, and they talk about like the EU association agreement and inclusion in organizations that would help tamper down on corruption because it's just like a role of being part of said organization. Like, these factors matter for Ukrainians. These day-to-day domestic differences matter for Ukrainians. That doesn't matter for the Mearsheimer view of it, because Mearsheimer, what he's saying was Mearsheimer's good analysis was Mearsheimer saying that entertaining Ukrainian membership of the European Union or integration with Europe to try to find a different economic pathway for the Ukrainians to pull themselves back up after they had entered a period of economic malaise and destruction, breaking records for inflation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when economic reports from Deutsche Bank before the collapse of the Soviet Union said that Ukraine was one of the countries with some of the best economic prospects moving forward. And then it became a country known for its street kids. It was extremely sad. They had to find new pathways, and they were trying to find one, which Russia said in the early 2000s was perfectly fine for them to explore until it wasn't. Until it didn't match with Russia's interests, because Ukraine becoming more economically intertwined with Europe means that they would not be as economically entwined with Russia in other ways. That was too much.
A curd is a curd.
To zoom out a little bit,
Would you ever got to Gaza after the war to interview people? Also, what's your opinion on gooning?
I'd like to go to Gaza at some point, but the problem is I'm dealing with one war at a time, right? One war at a time. It'd be like, oh my gosh, I put my family through enough. And then I'm like, you know what? We're doing 2, 3, 4 wars at the same time. I've got my contacts built here. I've done my work to get myself established here. So I'd like to work where I feel like I'm grounded and I feel like I have something to build off of. But it'd be nice to interview people for sure. As for the second question, I'm not going to answer. I condemn gooning.
during the Cold War, we drew the line at the Elbe River, halfway through Germany. On one side was the Soviet Union, and on the other side was NATO. And we're now, we're now talking about Ukraine, and you could sit here with a straight face and say, Putin is expansionist. Okay. I mean, if that's how you want to look at it, it's like, let's just look at the actual reality of what's happening here.
He is, okay. Number one, he is an expansionist. He's if this was just about NATO expansion, then he would have set up a rival Ukrainian government and occupy territory. And it wouldn't be, we're going to annex this and annex this. And this was always Russian in the anyway. They wouldn't be changing all the street names and tearing down the statues. They wouldn't be bragging about it either. If it was just about expansion. I mean, if he didn't have any beliefs about expansion or expansionism or Russia's empire not being properly represented by its current borders and them needing adjustments through force.
It's not that Putin has been this expansionist force. Putin has
by the way, when we're talking about the Soviet Union, we're talking about the entirety of the Soviet Union. The entirety of the Soviet Union then included like half of Germany, which, by the way, not a great arrangement for Germany, not a model to be copied. Especially, I mean, you can even see the divides in modern day German politics. But that was all of the Soviet Union. Why does Russia get to be just, okay, we get all these countries under our claim. They're ours. They're our allies, irrespective of what the locals want, irrespective to what conditions that puts upon the locals. Because I think the people in Belarus probably didn't like it when Russian soldiers came down and stamped out protests. Ukrainians wouldn't want to be part of that. And so if he's acknowledging that there is a moral difference between the domestic government, like I would say that matters for Ukrainians as well. But I mean, the Russians don't get a claim on all this territory just because they were also part of the Soviet Union.
Been almost at every turn reacting to the expansion of the American empire.
You gotta give them agency, man.
Ukraine. That's just not true. It's not denying someone agency to say that they're responding to something. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Responding to everything. That's all life.
Sure.
No one just acts without you didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
That's just
I don't think this is a great argument from Vaush. I think all he would have to do is like argue like here's all the things that Putin is actively doing in favor of his like nationalistic framework, changing the names, doing this. Why annex if this was not an irredentist project? These are the things that I think Vaush should be saying, not, well, everyone reacts to everything.
No?
Cop out. That doesn't mean anything.
You're the one providing the cop out. You're saying that it's not possible for Putin to have like a distinctly expansionist element to his rule because everyone's just responding to. So do you believe Putin has a distinctly expansionist?
He was laughing at the idea that he was an expansionist
element to his rule.
Okay, no, that's not a binary. One is it's not possible.
Wait, do you think he does or doesn't?
Hold on. So instead of just interrupting me, let me make the point. You just laid out a binary between is it possible he has expansionist intentions and does he have expansionist intentions? That's not a binary. There are some expansionist desires that he has. No, in fact, if you actually educate yourself on this topic. It was our CIA director who said in the Niet means Niet memo leaked by Julian Assange that verbatim, this was a choice that Vladimir Putin did not want to have to make. This was a choice that Russia did not want to get involved in this war.
And yet he made the choice.
They did not want to get involved in this war. They got involved in this war over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, directly with troops on the ground, both in Crimea and in the Donbass for over 8 years. Anytime when the ATO was not going the Russian separatist favor, they'd give them more air defense missiles to shoot down more civilian airliners or put troops on the ground, remove the Russian insignia on their thing and fight on the ground. Like if it was hesitant to get involved, they wouldn't be putting troops on the ground. Like imagine if America put troops on the ground to fight the Assad regime. Like they were literally boom, 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 shooting Assad soldiers. And we talked about it as America was hesitant to get involved in Syria. We were butchers in Syria because we send weapons to rebels. Russians send troops directly into Ukraine. Hesitant.
He made the choice to invade, to bring troops down to the Ukrainian border, to commit to multiple years of come on, this is the thing. I ask you for what can we do now? And immediately it's back to the Iron Curtain.
Well, hold on.
I know.
Vash, hold on. Here's what happened. I'm sorry.
I just want to know in the modern context.
I get it. Actually, what happened was you made a long statement and ended with that question. And I said, let me answer that question. But first, let me deal with what you said at the beginning of your statement. And then you started interrupting me. So no, it's not that I'm not willing to answer that question. It's that I had to point out, I think, a lot of the errors that you're making. Now, if you want just to say, what could we do right now? Well, look, we're going to have to be realists about this situation and admit that Ukraine is losing this war and that they're not going to drive Russia out of Crimea. That's a joke. They're not going to drive Russia out of many of the territories that they've
He talks so much about the nuance and how much he views it through a nuanced perspective. And Russia's doing it, try to advance on Kharkiv, get their teeth kicked in. They can't even take Volchansk and Lipsky. The disaster, terrible situation. There's active counteroffensives going on there right now. Russians taking massive losses, haven't been able to take Kramatorsk, haven't been able to take Konstantinivka, haven't been able to take Chasiv for months. When we talk about winning or losing, how are we defining these words? These words mean nothing unless given a context. So what's losing? Are they losing because they haven't taken back all their territory? Are they losing because of the bare minimum changes over the last year of the border? Are they losing because they have less troops than the Russians? Losing in one context. For me, if the most bland way you could describe the situation is a general stalemate. You could talk if you're talking about troop losses or the sustainability of armor in the long term. Are the Russians winning there? Probably not. When it comes to reclaiming territory in the next 6 months by the Ukrainians, that's not happening. The Russians conquering fucking Kramatorsk by the end of the year, that's not happening either. In every single oblast that the Russians want to conquer, except for Crimea, the Ukrainians still have territory in them. They're defending in Luhansk. I was there a few weeks ago watching it. Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They're defending in all these areas. The Russians want a territory the size of Taiwan on top of what they've already conquered. So these words the Russians are winning, the Russians are losing, the Ukrainians are winning, the Ukrainians are losing, these words mean nothing unless they're properly defined in context. What are the goals of victory? Because the original Russian goals of victory are nowhere close to being achieved. The ones that then the reassigned goals for victory, the new offensive operations, they were then changed, and then they were scrapped, and then they were scrapped, until eventually we've gotten to where we are now. And so when someone says one side's losing, one side's winning, I want to hear General Dave break down the war. Because right now on the ground, the Ukrainians feel buoyed by the failure of the Russian offensive on Kharkiv and then the localized counterattacks that the Ukrainians are doing. They're feeling buoyed by Western aid. Of course, this is always a snapshot in time. It's just that when I hear like these simplistic statements of this side's winning, this side's losing, like it means nothing to me. It right off, like water off a duck's back.
Taken right now. We should be working toward a deal, a peaceful solution, which has been on the table several times throughout this war, and it's been the West who has been trying to squash it.
Well,
so this is like, I think this is the Boris Johnson story that a lot of schmucks and alternative media podcasters still have been regurgitating. I would recommend Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is a good book which breaks down this claim and I think pretty solidly debunks it. Written by, I believe, I think it's the editor-in-chief of foreign affairs for the not the Washington Post, for the New York Times. There have been other breakdowns of this as well. I believe even like the former Israeli prime minister has taken back some of the things that were said and like reclarified. But the Boris Johnson story is a bunch of hooey. Most of the evidence doesn't point towards it being the deciding factor that made the Ukrainians keep fighting. And with the demands that have been released, which included Ukraine's almost complete demilitarization by the Russians as part of the Istanbul framework, which is the framework he must be discussing, because it's the only framework that there was real sit-down conversations about at all. The Russians and Ukrainians could not agree on their demilitarization because the Ukrainians had a basic, I guess a basic want to survive as a state and didn't feel like giving up all their guns to the Russians. So the Russians could then invade them again with less opposition. So there have been deals on the table. It's just that none of those deals have been agreeable. So the idea that we sabotaged it after the Russians invade a country and then while shooting at them say, put down your guns and we'll consider leaving. Like, come on.
Well, that's
what we
not
should do.
True at all, though. You've seen, I assume you've read the deals that Putin has put through. Zelensky hasn't been particularly amenable to them himself. The narrative that the West is squashing the peace deals, which is blown up largely because of that one Boris Johnson visit.
And that, by the way, is a robbing of Ukrainian autonomy because the Ukrainians have been the primary decision maker on what deals they will or will not take. It's been the West that has provided the Ukrainians support so that they could feel more confident in saying, no, we will not demilitarize. We will struggle for our country because without international support, it would be much, much more difficult. But it wasn't us making these calls to fight. I mean, the U.S. was usually the word for caution when it came to like Ukrainian-Russian relations, like they were during the Euromaidan protests.
Early on in the conflict. Don't get me wrong, okay? The West has its own interests. There are plenty of Western leaders who would like to see the Russian armories depleted. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine would have been jumping in the bit for any of the deals Putin's been offering since the war began. And Ukraine hasn't been losing. Both countries have been stalling. This has been like a slog, and it has been since the first, after the first 3 months of the war. I don't like the narrative that Ukraine's losing because the fact that they exist at all at this point, considering the Russian armaments aligned against them, is pretty impressive.
I mean, they're pulling guys off the streets to fight.
Oh,
what does that mean? The Russians do the same thing. It's an old, outdated Soviet conscription system that's inefficient. So the local authorities, usually conscription authorities, have resorted to just going to people off the street. They check their documents, and if their documents do not give them exemption, and they are healthy looking enough, depending on the conscription officer, then they sent off to conscription camp. That happening in Russia, that's happening in Ukraine. If that's a sign that the Ukrainians are losing, well, then the Russians are losing. Then the Russians have been losing since 2022.
Yeah, but and
look at that smug, ignorant smirk. All right. They aren't pulling people off the street. That means they're losing. I guess nobody's winning. I guess both Russia and Ukraine are losing. The true message is no one wins at war.
Russia has their penal colony forces with the Wagner group pulling from their multiple rounds of really unpopular conscriptions, waves of immigration out of Russia. People, no, of course.
That's not the discussion. Is about whether who's winning or losing. I thought. What does that have to do whether or not it's winning or losing?
Not. I'm not arguing that it's a matter of our investment or whether or not it's moral. War makes, unfortunately, unethical decision making of every side, including the good ones. The Allies did plenty of bad stuff during World War II.
Abraham Lincoln.
I'm only saying that it's been a slog for both sides. I don't want to see this out in like I don't want this conflict to end in a way that's going to guarantee the conflict reemerges in 2 years. If you end up just setting the border right where the fighting lines are right now, we're going to be exactly where we were back in 2014. We're going to have a combination of like paid separatists and Russian soldiers like moving around in the Donbass. There's going to be constant exchanges of fire across the border. This needs like a real international solution. I don't know whether that means like a proper DMZ. I don't know whether that means like genuine reconciliation. Ideally for me, it would be some kind of like Hail Mary where Ukraine gets its borders back and there's like a massive like coming together between Russia and the West and we like reopen trade and negotiations, but that's a little bit of a pipe dream. We do agree that, at least let's agree on this. If the line just freezes where it is right now, are we not guaranteeing another conflict in a few years?
I don't know that that's possible to say, to be honest.
People will be pretty mad.
Wait, that's impossible to say. But you can say with all certainty that if NATO didn't expand, that the Russians wouldn't have had any irredentist claims to capitalize upon or invade. You can say that with certainty. Because, like, the conclusion would be, if it is true that the Russians would still capitalize on irredentist claims, then that would just mean not only Ukraine would be up for grabs, but like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, all these countries which are currently bordering Russia would be up for claims too. Well, Finland.
I certainly, it's not guaranteeing. It's not guaranteeing it.
Finland probably less likely, but still.
I don't know. I don't think you do either.
Because if like, we're using the logic that like Dave is using, like, hey, they were all the way up to Germany, then okay, yeah, they were all the way up to Germany. Why shouldn't they march all the way back up to Germany?
Especially at the front, are not positively disposed to each other. I feel like we need to give them something solid, a solid piece, not just like, oh, we've decided now the slog has gone on for too long. They'd be throwing rocks at each other across the border, you know? You could get a 5-mile wide DMZ and they'd still be like sending drones over with bricks to drop at each other's heads.
Maybe this is all,
it'd be rough.
With the case of, in general, with all of the war hawks, everybody who's supported every single war over the last 20 years, it always kind of relies on this unfalsifiable counterfactual, like, oh, if we didn't do this, then Vladimir Putin would be invading Poland right now.
That's what he said about, he's like, he did a non-falsifiable earlier. It was like, well, if we didn't expand NATO, then the Russians wouldn't have, he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that at all. If it could just mean the situation would be worse and that a bunch of countries would not have a defensive alliance.
Now, or if the lines were drawn where they are, they'd be throwing rocks at each other or something. It's very hard to say. I think the one thing that, like, I think it's, again, to rely on a counterfactual, if that's what we're doing. I think the truth is that there were a lot of much better options. There were off-ramps all throughout the path to get here. And the truth is that if you want to go back to 2014, the West should not have gotten involved the way that it did. That it was such a provocation to back the overthrow of a democratically elected government.
You're right. As a libertarian, I do agree that government hiring gangs to beat up their population and murder its people needed to be respected. And we needed to tell those Ukrainians to settle down there, chief. Get shot a little bit more quiet, okay? Get shot. The idea that we could have controlled the Ukrainian people and told them to accept those indignities and be quiet where they could upset the balance of power and anger the Russians that were at that point trying to destroy the Ukrainian economy and were the ones backing this state-backed violence, providing many of the thugs to do said state-backed violence. I think that's a little naive. And this is why Ukrainians talk about the lack of respect to their sovereignty when these discussions are had. Like, we made agreements to protect Ukraine from Russian invasion and against the invasion of any state after it gave up its nuclear weapons. Then, after its government went back on promises in the middle of the night and made these promises in the middle of the night went back on these promises in the middle of the night in order to avoid backlash, he then tried to ban protesting, murdered over 100 people, and then hired gang members to beat up protesters. Like, what do you do? Like, yeah, is that not provocative? Was that not provocative? Was it not provocative for the Russians to shut down the border and shut down over 50% of cross cross-border trade, which was devastating for the Ukrainian economy? Was it provocative for him to intimidate the Ukrainian government into backing off of the association agreement, which wasn't even EU membership? It was a middle ground agreed to by a Putin lover. But it was not enough. It was not enough.
All you have to do is think to yourself and just be honest here.
We're in the past
Well, hold on.
again.
Let me just finish my point. If Russia or China had
God, Vaush would be so much better if you like hit him on this history or just went aggressive on this history.
backed the overthrow of the government in Mexico or Canada because they opted to sign a trade deal with us rather than
By the way, we did not back the overthrow. The overthrow happened, and then they had democratic elections to choose a new one. There was an overthrow that we did not endorse, but happened, and then we had to deal with the results of. And guess what? What were we going to say? We wish for the Ukrainian people to re-accept Yanukovych, who's already fled the country, right? To let him back in and make him rightful president again. Like the Ukrainians were immediately, this new government, trying to be reconciliatory towards the Russians on Crimea, on all sorts of issues. Like this presentation of our evil provocations during Euromaidan, it's just painting a one-sided picture that really, I think, undermines the general narrative he's making about the nuance of his position.
the one that they wanted them to sign. What do you think DC would do?
This is all, by the way, this is nothing new. This is all things I've heard a million times before. I thought it would be something different because I've never listened to Dave debate at length, but it's just the same old, same old.
And we all know the answer to that. They'd overthrow that government in a second. And we have a Monroe Doctrine for a reason. And you can say that it's like some relic of the past that faraway superpowers ought not intervene in the region of other large nations, but we certainly wouldn't feel that way. We wouldn't.
If we asked Dave if we should invade and conquer Venezuela, or if, hey, we just saw that there was a nuclear sub near Cuba, we got to go invade Cuba now, I assume his position would be we shouldn't do that, right?
Think it was a relic of the past if anybody tried to come over here and set up a military alliance with Mexico.
Russian nuclear submarines were just off of the shore of Cuba literally 2 weeks ago.
Or with Canada. Tell me how much DC would go, oh yes, the Monroe Doctrine is just a relic of the past.
Do you
Please.
think the Bay of Pigs invasion was justified?
No.
Because the Soviets invested economically and militarily.
I'm sorry, who was the one who giggled?
No.
Because the Soviets invested
I have no clue who this woman on the right is, but every contribution to this conversation, which was not good. I didn't like the giggle. I have very little to base my opinion off of right now, but it's going negative quick. I gotta pull myself out of it. I'm in a bad headspace. This is giving me bad vibes, this conversation all around. God, Ryan Grimm's eyes are so goddamn cold. Sorry, I just looked at it for like a second. You know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of the killer in what's that movie? What's No Country for Old Men. That's what those eyes remind me of. I don't know why, but it's striking.
economically and militarily into a country.
Where Dave kind of looks like a puppet dog, looking up at you curiously after tearing up the bed cushions.
That is just off our coast during a time of heightened international conflict. They knew that it would antagonize us. We already had strained relationship with Castro, even though we.
Does Vaush wear pop? I'm sorry, I'm making a lot of visual commentary now. Does Vaush usually wear collared shirts? Is this a thing he does? Is this new? Is it to match the glasses? Is this a new thing?
Didn't initially, of course, because we recognized that he was a much better leader for the Cuban people than the man he replaced. Do you not think the Soviets antagonized us in a way much comparable to what we have done with NATO and Ukraine? Like,
Yes,
again,
they did.
No. We haven't placed any nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The Russians placed nukes in Cuba. Like, if the Russians wanted to make an agreement right now to stop the deployment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which is something that they fearmonger quite a lot about, I am positive the Ukrainians and the West would accept that deal in a heartbeat if it meant the Russians would leave.
Oh, they did. Okay. So do you think then following the Bay of Pigs? Well, wait. This isn't a gotcha. This is a gotcha. I think it's an interesting question because I do think the Soviets were a little bit wacky with how they handled Cuba. But I feel like in retrospect, we don't talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion as an inevitable consequence of expansionist Soviet investment in spite of our national interest. I think we think about it as like Kennedy's mistake, you know?
Right. Okay. But see, a lot of the reason why we think of it as Kennedy's mistake is the logistics of it. By the way, if you really want to get into it, it wasn't Kennedy's mistake as much as it was the CIA.
Wait, but is Dave in favor of the Bay of Pigs? But Dave said he wasn't. So, I mean, either way.
Previous administration,
But regardless of any of that, see, what you asked me is if I thought the Bay of Pigs was justified. And I would also say that, no, I don't think Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was justified. Do I think that the Soviets and the Cubans were taking a provocative stance against the United States of America? Of course. Did those provocations lead to the Bay of Pigs? I think that's undeniable. And the truth is that from Vladimir Putin's got a much...
But we didn't put any nukes in Ukraine. We just talked about Ukraine possibly joining NATO, which Putin was previously okay about. And then it was like, okay, that's not happening. Then the Russians invade, take a bunch of land, fight over it for 8 years. We sit back, do very little about it. The Ukrainians build up to defend themselves. And then the Russians invade again because they were unsatisfied. Like this is not comparable. You cannot compare these two things. We made Ukraine give up its nukes to appease the Russians, and the Russians invade Ukraine. That's the exact opposite of the situation we're describing. Ever.
Stronger case about the provocations of the United States of America, because it's not just one little island.
And it wasn't like, and when we talk about Ukraine's case, these are weapons they inherited from the Soviet Union. These were not weapons that were given to them by the Soviets specifically to position in. They just ended up with them once the regime fell. Like the dynamics of this it's just not comparable. I don't like this comparison.
Or one economic deal. It's been a steady push eastward since the late 90s.
But now that we are where we are, go right ahead.
Before we go too far, I just want to stand up for the dignity of the Cuban Revolution for just a moment.
Please.
Least surprising development.
Yeah, it was not a Soviet project. This was an organic Cuban project against the corrupt elites in Cuba.
Kind of weird. Nobody took a moment to, say this about Euromaidan, even though the discussion is about Ukraine, but we're diverting the entire debate to make this comment about Cuba, but okay.
Fidel Castro, in the beginning...
you ask Euromaidan protesters, what was one of their main problems? Corruption. Big reason they were out there.
Thought he could maintain some decent relations with the United States. It was Che Guevara who witnessed in 1954. He was in...
God, left-wing conversations about Ukraine are just so bad. And like Dave's not even like a left-winger. He's not. He's like a libertarian. But like, God, man, these conversations on whatever. I'm just gonna be whinging about the things I've whinged about before. Nothing new. Nothing new. Same old pain.
Guatemala. When the U.S. overthrew our Benz, and he was the one always saying to Fidel Castro, "You're not going to be able to work with the Yankees. Like, it's not possible." Castro wanted to. Like, he was like, "Look, no, these guys are corrupt. I'm George Washington here." It was only when it became impossible for the Cubans to work, for the Cuban revolutionaries to work with the U.S., that they went in the Soviet direction.
And in fact, Ryan,
doesn't make it just, but go ahead, Dave.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong.
Allies.
Correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I also believe that Castro had been rejecting communism up to the point that the U.S. started putting embargoes on him before he then said, "Oh yeah, I'm a communist." And so you could certainly argue that we drove him into the hands of the Soviets.
Right, and I think it plays further into the broader dynamic where basically.
So maybe the Russians invading Ukraine over and over drove them further and further to the hands of the West? Was that not a provocative? Sorry, whatever.
Everybody acts as a reaction to previous acts. Very rarely does something, sort of come up whole cloth. You almost always, even for the United States, I mean, with all of our power and might, we are still responding to, the actions and decision making of agents that are of themselves responding to others. In the world today,
we all learned that we're one and the world is interconnected. 30 minutes into this debate.
Where we are now, because there are a million places that I could have turned the clocks back and changed history and brought us to a different point. For me personally, the big line wasn't with NATO. It was with economic investment in Russia and the shock therapy. You know, I think that was the real line where we like lost the post-Cold War world, where we arrogantly decided that, you know, having like won over the Soviets, we would do a victory lap by annihilating their economies, you know, arrogantly like pillaging them and leaving them to the oligarchs who had worked with us in like a business relation sense. If there was anything I could go back.
Can I just throw out there very quickly that this also assumes, and while I agree with some part of this, a lot of this assumes like an almost direct control relationship. Like we can choose the government over there. We can choose if they're corrupt or not corrupt. If a lot of the old party guard and elite end up gobbling up old industries, like how much control do we really have to stop that from happening? I mean, there's certain like economic policies that we advocated for that could have been done differently. But like the problems with the Russian economy today and oligarchical control and corruption, I don't like how much control did we really have to stop that development? I'm saying this because this is a genuine question I have.
Back and change, it would be that, you know, I'm not really particularly fussed about NATO in particular. Military alliances are always going to carry with them, let's say, problematic elements. NATO is just the Western military alliance, everything that insinuates and carries. If we got along with Russia properly, maybe all of this could have been avoided. I mean, hell, it could have extended far enough east. We could be on better relations with China. We wouldn't have people like Trump trying to constantly push for a second Cold War with like the tariff. And well, Biden did that too recently with the electric vehicles. So I guess everybody wants a Cold War with China. Things could have been
really
better.
Started with Obama.
Yeah, no, we all, because we need a foreign threat. We need a foreign threat.
Exactly.
Russia wasn't doing it for us, and they're certainly not going to be doing it now, partly because...
So let me just say, because I think there's something almost being lost here where, look, Vaush, technically speaking, you are right that everybody is reacting. And you are right that every nation is, you know, like I'm a radical libertarian. I think basically, essentially all governments are criminal organizations. So you don't have to like convince me on that. The thing here that separates things is that after 1991, America became the first global superpower. The level of power, it's funny, I have to explain this to a leftist, but the level of power that America had was totally asymmetrical to anything else. And
I'm just hearing this for the first time.
Right. And so yes, it is. Like, it is true that there are all of these different nations that are reacting to different things. However, if you actually look at the role that the United States of America played, and then think about it from, say,
But look what the Russians did in that same period. They started wars. They started war. They invaded Chechnya twice. They invaded Moldova.
Corrupt,
there was an irredentism and a belief of their control of their quote-unquote backyard, which happens to be the fucking largest backyard in the entire world, that still existed even under Yeltsin. And Yeltsin, I mean, even would comment to Clinton that, oh, just let me deal with European affairs. Let me handle European security. I'll do it good. I'll do it good. Like, you can find these old transcripts of them going back and forth about it. Like, this is... I think we're going to end this very... You know what? Can we just end this now? I've heard nothing new in this debate. And the most of this is stuff we've heard before. This goes for another... How long? Another hour. More than an hour. No, I mean another 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes, more than half an hour. And it's going to take another 2 hours to get through it, because I do the thing where if I hear anything that's wrong, I'm going to call it out. And I feel like I'm going to hear a bunch of the same things. Yeah, no, I'm done with this. I'm done. Dave Smith did not really bring, I think, much new information to the table. I think he said a bunch of premises that were false and then built upon those false premises like an unstable Jenga tower. I think Vaush did not do a fantastic job of arguing any of the historical points. I don't think he knows the historical points very well. Or if he does, which is possible, and he's chosen not to engage on them, I think that's a failure on him. I think he might think that arguing this stuff doesn't matter to most people, but I think it makes it seem like Dave knows more about it than you. And there's a certain credibility that comes with that, or at least that perception that wins people over in conversation. Not to mention, like, correcting those historical inaccuracies should be one of the big goals of pro-Ukraine people, because I do believe, you know, the truth doesn't necessarily lend itself to any framework or overarching narrative or ideology or diatribe or doctrine, like 100%. But I do believe that the truth of the matter, for people who care about state sovereignty, for people who care about personal liberty as well, I mean, many of the times I've spoken in the United States about Ukraine, it's been at libertarian conferences, have reasons to support Ukraine's struggle. Debating the specifics is one thing, but getting the history wrong is another, and it's something that needs to be corrected. It's a general toxicity problem of the culture and debate around Ukraine, of these kind of statements just getting said again and again and again and again and again until they become unquestionable gospel, and breaking them down a little bit is a laudable task. Dylan, do you support this Palestinian struggle? Like the struggle for an independent state? Yeah, I believe they should have an independent state. Have you seen the great new house? No, I'm not watching New Norm. Okay, people are recommending New Norm in chat. I think we've come to the end point in today's stream.